Ethan Marshall, 38, lived in a small, dimly lit apartment in Portland, Oregon, a space cluttered with unopened mail, coffee-stained papers, and the faint, persistent smell of damp carpet that never quite went away despite his futile attempts to air it out. The rain drummed against the window pane as he settled into his threadbare armchair, the glow of his laptop casting sharp, unnatural shadows across his face. He had just finished scanning through endless spreadsheets for his job at a modest accounting firm, the numbers blurring together in his fatigue, when he felt it, a subtle, almost imperceptible itch beneath the thick hair at the back of his scalp. He reached a hand up instinctively, pushing strands aside, and his fingers brushed against something that felt wrong. Not quite a pimple, not quite a scab, but hard and slightly warm beneath the skin. He froze, a shiver running down his spine, and laughed quietly at himself, dismissing it as a minor irritation, a consequence of stress, or maybe an allergic reaction to the cheap shampoo he'd tried last week. Over the next hour, the itch worsened, sharp and persistent, spreading like tiny electric pulses across the base of his skull. He ran his fingers through his hair again and recoiled. The skin there was slightly raised, discolored, with a faint yellow tint that made his stomach churn. A tiny bead of liquid appeared at the surface, glistening as though it were wet metal, and when he pressed lightly, a faint, putrid smell rose to his nostrils, mingling unpleasantly with the stale coffee in the room. Panic gripped him briefly, but he tried to reason it away, telling himself he would see a pharmacy cream in the morning, nothing more. Yet a subtle, horrifying sensation lingered beneath his fingertips. Something alive, wriggling beneath the skin, and the sound of soft, almost inaudible movement, like tiny bones shifting, resonated faintly in the otherwise silent room. Dinner was cold leftovers from the night before, untouched as he focused on the itching that now had a rhythmic pulse to it, almost synchronized with his own heartbeat. He tried to call his friend Mark, who lived a few blocks down, but hesitated, embarrassed at how ridiculous he sounded when he muttered something about a scalp irritation. He imagined Mark laughing, suggesting he overreacted, and Ethan's anxiety twisted tighter in his gut. He went to the bathroom, flicking on a yellowed light above the mirror, and as he parted his hair, he froze. The skin near the nape of his neck looked subtly different, small reddish protrusions that had not been there in the morning, tiny bumps that pulsed faintly, as if something beneath them was breathing. His stomach roiled at the thought, but he quickly turned away, blaming shadows and fatigue. That night, sleep was fitful. The rain's patter against the windows mingled with the occasional whisper of wind that seemed almost human. When he awoke, a cold sweat coated his brow. His head throbbed, and the itch had escalated to a low-grade burn. Trembling, he lifted a hand to his hair, and the moment his fingers touched the back of his scalp, a wet, sticky substance clung to his fingertips. He recoiled, gagging at the sharp, metallic stench, and stared in disbelief at the strands of hair that now seemed matted with a grayish-yellow pus. Panic overtook him fully now, and he ran to the bathroom, flicking on the light and stepping back as his eyes adjusted. The bumps had multiplied, small, conical shapes pushing upward, some split at the tips, exuding a thick, viscous liquid that shimmered in the harsh light. He thought he saw movement in the larger ones, a subtle squirming, a tiny ripple beneath the surface, but when he leaned closer, blinking rapidly, it stopped. His reflection stared back at him, pale, haggard, eyes wide with fear, hair sticking out in damp, greasy clumps. He could feel something shifting beneath the surface as he watched, and a sudden, horrible realization struck. This was no ordinary infection. Something was growing, something alive and alien, under his skin. He tried calling a doctor, his voice shaking, but every clinic he reached either dismissed him over the phone, citing long wait times, or asked him to come in the next week, as if his urgent, desperate description of moving lesions and foul odors was trivial. The helplessness gnawed at him, a knot of terror twisting through his chest. He avoided mirrors now, kept his hair covered, and avoided human contact, even at work, where he felt the stares of colleagues he could not see, the judgmental eyes he imagined. At night, he could hear faint whispers in the dark, subtle yet distinct, a susurration that seemed to come from within his own skull, a voice calling his name in tones too soft to locate, but too deliberate to ignore. By the third day, he was sleeping in fits of panic, waking repeatedly to scratches and squelches he could not explain, small warm spots forming beneath his pillow, strange odors clinging to his hair and clothes. His hands were perpetually slick with moisture that smelled of rust and decay. And when he scratched, his nails met resistance, something tough and pliable beneath the surface that wriggled like a worm. He dared not tell anyone. Even if he did, he feared they would think him insane, and he could not bear the thought of being shunned, labeled as contaminated, or worse. The isolation became a protective cocoon, a feeble defense against a world that might turn on him the moment it saw what had begun to claim him. The itch intensified, becoming unbearable, the pulsating bumps merging into larger, irregular mounds that throbbed with a life of their own. One of them had a darkened tip, almost black, and when he brushed it with a fingernail, it squelched, releasing a thin stream of gray pus that left a streak on his scalp and a scent like burned iron in the air. Horror rooted him to the spot. Panic surged, and for a fleeting moment, he imagined reaching for scissors, cutting away the hair, trying to see the damage fully, but dread froze him because he already knew he could not undo whatever was happening. By the fourth day, he could no longer ignore the sounds. The whispers had evolved into distinct, deliberate noises. Tiny clicks, soft slurps, the faint squirming of something crawling just beneath the skin. He would press his palms to his head and feel something moving beneath them, a slow, deliberate undulation that made him gag. He avoided the mirror entirely, but when he accidentally glimpsed a reflection in the window during a passing bus, he froze. His hair appeared to shift unnaturally, matted in strange, bulbous shapes that quivered in synchronization with his heartbeat. And then he felt it, a subtle protrusion at the base of his skull, something round, hard, and hot, moving slowly but with purpose, something that was definitely not part of him, but had become inexorably intertwined with his body. Ethan tried to sleep, but the room felt impossibly close, the rain against the glass like hammering nails, the shadows stretching and contracting in ways that made his skin crawl. He could hear his own heartbeat, and beneath it, the pulse of something alien, synchronized yet independent, a rhythm that was neither his nor entirely separate. When he dared to touch the lump, it moved under his fingers, a subtle squirming, as if alive, as if aware, and his stomach turned with disgust and terror. He stumbled to the kitchen, splashing cold water on his face, trying to wash away the sensation, but the odor clung. Iron, rot, and the faintly sweet stink of decay. He considered leaving, going to an emergency room immediately, but a part of him hesitated, dread pressing on his chest. What would they think when they saw it? Would they scream? Would they call the police? Would he even be able to speak coherently? Or would the shock make him collapse before they could help? He could not know. So he stayed, pacing the tiny apartment, feeling the bulge move beneath the thick hair at the nape of his neck, feeling the first pangs of nausea and weakness as his body protested against whatever was consuming it from within. That night, the itch turned into a throb, the squirming became more pronounced, and a single, terrifying crack echoed in the otherwise silent apartment, emanating from the lump itself. Ethan dropped to his knees, pressed his ear to the base of his skull, and heard something unmistakable, a wet, deliberate movement, a tiny snapping, and a high-pitched, almost imperceptible voice whispering his name. He recoiled, shaking, tears pricking his eyes, and stumbled to the mirror on the bathroom wall. His reflection stared back at him, but it was wrong. The lump had grown, swelling beneath the scalp, a dark, oozing mass with subtle movements visible just under the skin. Tiny black threads seemed to writhe within it, and as he leaned closer, he realized that the skin over it glistened unnaturally, stretched tight over something alive. The whispering intensified, now a chorus of soft, hungry voices, and Ethan stumbled backward, gagging, his mind teetering on the edge of collapse. He could not deny it any longer. Something was inside him, something alien, growing and alive, and he had no idea how to stop it. The lump pulsed again, with a wet, almost conscious motion, and Ethan realized with a shudder that the whispers were not just noises but words, phrases he could understand, speaking directly into his mind. "We are hungry. We are growing. We are inside." He fell to the floor, trembling, and the last coherent thought before darkness overtook him was a simple, horrifying question. How long before it claimed everything? The days that followed blurred into a haze of fear and revulsion as Ethan tried desperately to maintain some semblance of normalcy. He went to work, though every step felt heavier than the last, and each movement of his scalp sent waves of discomfort through his skull, as though the thing inside him had learned to anticipate his motions. The lump had grown noticeably, a dark, undulating mass hidden beneath his hair, its movements subtle but unmistakable, and the pus that sometimes seeped through the skin carried the same metallic stench that made him gag and retreat to empty corridors for relief. He wore hats indoors, pulled his hair low over his forehead, and avoided mirrors at all costs, yet he could not escape the sensation of eyes upon him, the imagined stares of coworkers who surely noticed the subtle changes. His pallor, the way he flinched at certain touches, the tiny, almost imperceptible twitches of his scalp. Each interaction became a trial. A passing remark from his colleague about his distracted demeanor or pale skin sent shivers down his spine and a flush of shame across his face. Ethan smiled and nodded, telling polite lies about late nights and stress, but inside, he was unraveling. By midweek, the lump had multiplied. Small, reddish nodules now dotted the back of his scalp, clustered like grotesque berries. Some were still tiny, barely raised, but others swelled and pulsated with a life of their own, and Ethan could feel them move beneath his fingers, wriggling with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He tried applying over-the-counter creams and antiseptics, but they only made the surface skin sting, and the odor intensified, filling the apartment with the sharp, nauseating scent of decay mixed with rust. He washed his hair obsessively, scrubbing at the bumps, but the relief was fleeting, and the foul odor returned within hours, clinging to his clothing and sheets. Sleep became nearly impossible, each night a marathon of tossing, scratching, and listening to the faint whispers and squelches from beneath his skin, voices that now seemed more coherent, forming words that made him recoil in terror. "We see you, we grow, we hunger." They whispered in sync with the pulsations beneath the surface, each beat a cruel reminder that he was no longer in control of his own body. At work, he avoided the fluorescent-lit break room, the communal coffee machine, and any close interaction. He kept a low profile, staring at spreadsheets, muttering vague responses, but he could sense the attention drawn to him, a mixture of concern and silent disgust, though no one could possibly understand the true horror he carried beneath his hair. During a mid-morning meeting, he felt a sudden, violent twitch from the base of his skull, a sharp, wriggling motion that made him wince and press his hands to his head, feeling something thick and sticky slide beneath his fingers. A bead of gray pus oozed to the surface, warm and revolting, leaving a faint, metallic stench in the air. Ethan excused himself, claiming a headache, and fled to the empty stairwell, gagging and trembling as he pressed the back of his head to the cold concrete wall, trying to calm the writhing mass beneath his scalp. By the weekend, his social isolation had deepened. His phone remained silent. Unread messages from friends, he no longer had the energy to respond to piling up. He avoided Mark entirely, knowing he could never describe what was happening without sounding insane. The whispers under his skin had grown louder and more distinct. Now he could hear multiple voices, some male, some female, all whispering, sometimes arguing, sometimes mocking him. "Let us out. We are hungry. We are part of you." Ethan scratched obsessively, drawing blood and a dark, viscous fluid that smelled like rust and burnt rubber, but the movement beneath his skin did not abate. At times, he could feel a tiny pulse moving independently, a directionality, as if the mass were exploring his skull, pushing against nerves, seeking weak spots, testing boundaries. The odor became impossible to mask. When he briefly stepped outside for air, the damp Portland streets carried the scent of rain and wet asphalt. But beneath it all, he smelled himself. Something rotten and iron-like, a smell that made pedestrians recoil slightly as they passed. Ethan caught glimpses of movement and reflections, quick flashes of grotesque shapes beneath his hair. And once, in a mirrored surface of a store window, he swore he saw a small, black, worm-like structure slide along the surface of his scalp, disappearing just as quickly as it had appeared. Panic seized him. He ducked into an alley, hands gripping his head, heart racing, imagining what someone would think if they saw it, if they knew. The shame was overwhelming, but more than that, the fear that this was not reversible, that the thing growing inside him was alive, aware, and expanding with each passing hour, gnawed at his mind like acid. Unable to sleep, Ethan roamed his apartment, touching and pressing the bumps, watching as some of them squirmed and pulsed with alarming autonomy. Tiny black threads occasionally surfaced, vanishing before he could examine them properly. The sensation of movement beneath the skin was now constant, a low-level horror that never ceased, even when he tried to distract himself with television or music. Every mirror in the apartment became a sight of dread, reflections warped by shadows that seemed to pulse in time with the lumps. And Ethan began to suspect that the growths were more than biological, some part of his perception twisted by their presence, a creeping influence that reached into his thoughts and emotions. By the end of the second week, Ethan had tried everything he could think of, over-the-counter ointments, antiseptic washes, hot compresses, even desperate attempts to extract pus or break open the lumps with tweezers. Each effort ended in failure. The bumps resisted, wriggled, and sometimes hissed faintly, a wet, almost insectal sound, as though the mass beneath his skin were alive and reacting. One evening, exhausted and trembling, he looked into the bathroom mirror, pulling his hair aside, and the sight made him stagger back in horror. The skin at the back of his scalp had split slightly, a thin line exposing a dark, moist cavity beneath which black threads writhed in slow, deliberate movements. One of the lumps bulged violently, then shivered and emitted a small, wet squeal as though it were testing the air outside its confinement. The smell of rust and decay filled his nostrils, thick and cloying, and Ethan felt bile rise in his throat. He gagged, pressing a towel against his head, but the movement beneath continued, pulsating and wriggling with a life of its own, almost rhythmic, almost sentient. Sleep that night was impossible. Ethan dozed fitfully in a chair, head leaning against his desk, hands pressed desperately to his scalp, feeling the squirming undulations of the growing mass beneath. He dreamed in fragmented visions, the lumps splitting open into grotesque mouths, black threads slithering out to writhe across his skin, whispers speaking his name in tones both intimate and menacing. He woke with sweats soaking his pajamas, heart racing, and found that the lumps had indeed grown overnight, swollen and taut, glistening with gray pus, one of them protruding noticeably, a round, bulbous mound that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. And then he felt it, a sharp, deliberate movement, like a tiny hand or claw pressing from inside, pushing against the surface. His scream caught in his throat as he pressed his palms flat against it, feeling the squirming, sensing intelligence, awareness, an almost conscious force that pulsed beneath the skin. Desperate, he reached for his laptop, typing frantic searches for conditions, infections, infestations, but nothing matched what he described. The words on the screen blurred, the glow of the monitor casting unnatural shadows, and he realized the whispers were no longer confined to his scalp. They had entered his mind, overlapping his thoughts, murmuring constantly, pressing, insistent. "We are hungry. We grow. You cannot stop us." He clutched his head, tears streaming, and for the first time, the reality he had known seemed distant, unreliable, like a fragile glass sphere cracking under pressure. Outside, the rain fell steadily, the streets slick and gray, but inside, his own apartment smelled like iron and decay, the air thick with the wet, clinging odor of something alien thriving within him. The next day, the growth began to spread beyond the back of his scalp. Small nodules appeared along the sides, under the ears, some with faintly translucent tips revealing the dark, wriggling mass beneath. Ethan could feel the movement traveling outward, exploring new areas, seeking weak points. A particularly large nodule formed just above the nape, pressing against his skull so forcefully that he imagined it might break through at any moment. When he pressed it, it pulsed in response, moving with intent, and a wet, sucking sound echoed faintly in the confined space of his apartment. He gagged violently, staggering to the bathroom, pressing his face into the sink, wishing, praying that it would stop, that it would go away, that someone, anyone, could save him. Attempts to contact doctors yielded nothing. Most refused to see him without an appointment. One receptionist suggested he try a dermatologist. Another suggested that stress and hygiene were the likely causes. Ethan hung up each call, trembling, knowing they would see only the outside, never the horrors growing beneath his skin, the subtle, sentient movement that could not be described without sounding insane. He could not even speak of the whispers. They had become voices, distinct entities, taunting him, speaking in languages that seemed to shift and twist. Yet he understood every word. "We are here. We are part of you. You belong to us." His mind recoiled from the pronouncement, a physical shiver running through him, and he staggered to the mirror, bracing himself. When he looked, the sight made him stumble backward in terror. The largest lump had grown into a grotesque, swollen mound, black at its tip, glistening, with subtle movements inside that suggested something alive and intelligent. Tiny threads writhed beneath the taut skin, some protruding and curling, exploring the air. The smell was overwhelming now, metallic, sweet, putrid, clinging to the walls of the bathroom, the towel, his clothes. He pressed a hand to the mass, feeling it push against his palm, resisting, testing his strength. A sudden, sharp twitch made him scream, and the lump rippled violently, releasing a thin spray of grayish pus that landed on the counter, the smell thick and suffocating. The whispers grew louder, the voices now distinct, articulate, sinister. "We grow, we take, we are inside you forever." Ethan sank to the floor, knees drawn to his chest, hands clutching his head. The fear, shame, and revulsion were suffocating. He could no longer ignore the reality. The thing inside him was alive, aware, expanding, and he was utterly powerless to stop it. His thoughts spiraled. How long before it consumed him entirely? How long before others noticed? How long before he became something else entirely? The lump pulsed again beneath his fingers, a wet, deliberate squirming, and Ethan knew that his life, his body, and his very mind were slipping beyond his control. He could not call anyone, could not explain, could not hide much longer. And then, with a horrifying clarity, he felt the largest lump split slightly, exposing a dark cavity, and within, a single black, glistening thread-like appendage quivered, reaching outward, testing the air, and Ethan realized with a gut-wrenching certainty that whatever had taken root beneath his hair was no longer confined. It was awake, aware, and it wanted more. Ethan's world had contracted into a claustrophobic nightmare where every mirror, every reflection, every stray beam of light reminded him that he no longer fully inhabited his own body. The lumps on his scalp had multiplied and morphed into grotesque, bulbous growths, some the size of marbles, others larger, oozing grayish pus that reeked of iron and decay, the smell so pervasive it clung to his hair, his clothes, even the walls of his apartment. Threads of black, sinewy tissue wriggled beneath the taut, glistening skin, moving with a deliberate, almost predatory intent, and sometimes he swore he could feel the things burrowing deeper into the soft tissue beneath his skull. Sleep had become a distant memory. Nights were filled with soft, wet squelches, faint whispering that grew louder with the hours, voices murmuring in distorted tones, sometimes repeating his name, sometimes chanting unintelligible sequences that made his skin crawl and his stomach turn. He could not touch the growths without feeling them react, as if they were aware, alive, testing his limits, asserting control over the fragile human vessel he once took for granted. By the third week, Ethan could no longer hide the changes. Even under his long hair and hooded jackets, the movement beneath the scalp was unmistakable to himself, a constant, torturous presence. The sensation of something alive pushing against his skull, burrowing, probing, was relentless. Tiny threads poked through the skin in random bursts, curling and retracting with wet, sucking noises. He would press his hands over them, feeling them squirm and resist, and the mingled scent of decay and metallic rust was nauseating. The whispers had grown into distinct, almost coherent voices, some mocking, some persuasive, and occasionally overlapping with his own thoughts until he could not distinguish where his mind ended and the malignant presence beneath his scalp began. "We are here. We will grow. You belong to us." Ethan trembled and recoiled each time, but the words echoed relentlessly, a sinister chorus in the confines of his skull. Attempts to seek medical help ended in frustration and despair. General practitioners dismissed him, offering vague diagnoses of dermatitis, cysts, or stress-induced inflammation, all while giving him the standard advice to keep his scalp clean. Dermatologists were even more skeptical, some glancing briefly at the small lesions before asking invasive questions about hygiene and lifestyle, the subtle disgust in their eyes fueling Ethan's shame. None could, or would, examine the true horrors beneath his hair. Desperation drove him to search online obsessively, scouring obscure forums, medical journals, and conspiracy sites, seeking any mention of infestations, parasitic growths, or sentient tumors. The information was fragmentary, sometimes contradicting, and often left him more terrified. There were mentions of unknown fungal infections, aggressive parasitic masses, rare congenital anomalies, but nothing matched the intelligent, wriggling, whispering masses that had made his skull a cage. Isolation became his only refuge. Friends stopped calling, coworkers stopped noticing him altogether, and Ethan's apartment became a prison of his own making. He barricaded himself in, avoided mirrors, and limited all contact with the outside world. The rain outside Portland's gray skies was relentless, mirroring the constant damp, suffocating odor that clung to his apartment. The very air seemed to conspire against him, thick with the iron-tinged stench of his own body. He could hear the faint scuttling of threads beneath the skin, the soft squelching and popping of pus-filled nodules, the subtle shifts in the texture of his scalp as if the things beneath were moving independently, exploring the planes of his skull, testing boundaries, growing more intelligent with every passing hour. In moments of fleeting courage, he would attempt to inspect the growths. Pulling aside his hair, he saw nodules glisten wetly, tiny black threads wriggling in rhythmic undulations beneath the translucent, taut skin. Grayish pus bubbled at the edges, giving off a metallic, burnt smell, and when he pressed lightly, the things inside twitched violently, resisting, curling, probing outward. At times, one would split open slightly, revealing a cavity lined with writhing threads that seemed to stretch and contract as though breathing. The sight made him gag violently, and he would stagger back, heart racing, palms pressed to his scalp, whispering desperate prayers for relief that never came. Ethan's mental state deteriorated alongside his body. He began to doubt his own perception, questioning whether the movement beneath his scalp was real or a manifestation of his unraveling mind. But the stench, the tactile squirming, the wet, sucking noises confirmed the reality of his torment. Sleep-deprived and terrified, he began experiencing hallucinations, shadows in corners that moved independently, reflections in windows that did not mimic his movements, voices emanating from empty rooms. The boundaries between self and the invading mass blurred, and Ethan increasingly feared that the lumps were learning, thinking, controlling. Sometimes he would catch the threads moving with apparent intelligence, curling towards sensitive areas of his neck or temples, forcing him to flinch or cry out involuntarily. He knew he was losing autonomy, and the knowledge filled him with a suffocating despair. During one particularly harrowing evening, as the rain lashed against his windows and the streetlights cast distorted shadows across the apartment, Ethan attempted to clean the worst of the lesions. Using antiseptic and tweezers, he tried to drain a particularly large growth at the back of his skull, the one that had become almost unnervingly bulbous. As he pressed, it squirmed violently, oozing thick, gray pus that smelled of burnt metal and decay. The black threads within twisted and writhed in his fingers, curling around his tools, resisting, and he felt a sharp pain shoot through his skull, as if the thing beneath were retaliating. It was alive, consciously alive, and in that moment, Ethan understood the terrifying magnitude of his predicament. Whatever had invaded him was not a passive disease. It was a sentient presence, embedded within him, intertwined with his very flesh and nervous system. He dropped the tools in horror, gagging, as a wet squelch echoed through the bathroom, and the lump quivered, pulsing in sync with his panicked heartbeat. The following day, the growths continued their expansion, creeping beyond the scalp toward his forehead and temples. Tiny black appendages poked through the skin intermittently, curling in the air, twitching as if testing new territory. Each nodule emitted a low, wet squelch when disturbed, and the metallic stench intensified to a point that made breathing in his own apartment almost unbearable. Whispers had become a constant presence, an intrusive chorus in his mind. "We are inside you. We grow. We will not stop." Ethan began scratching compulsively, drawing blood, the grayish pus mingling with crimson streaks, leaving patches of exposed, raw flesh that throbbed in response to the writhing mass beneath. Pain and revulsion merged into an unending cycle, each sensation reminding him of the alien presence controlling his body. By the end of the third week, Ethan was almost unrecognizable to himself. His scalp had transformed into a landscape of bulging nodules and writhing threads, gray pus seeping constantly. Ethan awoke in a haze of nausea and fear, the apartment around him seeming simultaneously familiar and alien. Every corner warped by shadows that stretched too long, walls that seemed to pulse faintly, and the faint, metallic tang of decay thick in the air. His scalp throbbed violently, the nodules bulging grotesquely, each pulsation accompanied by a wet, sucking sound that made his stomach churn. Black, wiry threads pushed outward from the largest growths, curling in the air like tiny, searching appendages, twitching with a life of their own, testing the limits of his skin and muscle. The pus oozed constantly, a gray, viscous river scented of rust and burnt metal, seeping down his neck and staining his collar, clinging to the fine hairs like a living thing. Each movement he made caused the threads to writhe, sometimes with deliberate resistance, and Ethan understood that his own motor functions were no longer entirely under his control. The mass beneath his scalp was learning him, anticipating him, shaping his body in subtle, terrifying ways. Desperate for relief, Ethan attempted to examine the worst of the growths, moving his hair aside and prying at one particularly grotesque nodule at the back of his head. The lump had expanded to the size of a fist, the skin stretched taut, glistening with a wet sheen, and as he pressed it lightly, the threads within reacted violently, wriggling upward, curling around his fingers, pulling sharply and eliciting a guttural cry of pain. Gray pus burst from tiny fissures, the smell of decay and iron hitting him with suffocating intensity, making his eyes water and his stomach churn. He fell back onto the floor, shaking, gagging, his mind swimming with fear, yet unable to look away as the mass quivered and pulsed, sending ripples across the scalp as though it had an intelligence of its own, observing him, teasing him, mocking him. The whispers had grown louder, a chorus now, sometimes overlapping with his own thoughts, sometimes speaking in tones eerily familiar, other times in distorted cadences that made his brain reel. "We are you. We are stronger. We are everywhere." By mid-morning, Ethan realized he could not remain in the apartment any longer. The mass had begun expanding beyond the scalp, creeping across his forehead, temples, and even the back of his neck, small tendrils burrowing into his hairline, pushing at his skin with persistent, probing force. Each step he took caused the threads to undulate beneath his skin, and he could feel their pressure along his skull, almost as if they were seeking new territory. He avoided mirrors, but every reflective surface, every window, betrayed the creeping horror, the subtle distortion of his human form. Passers-by in the street would occasionally glance at him, and he imagined them recoiling, seeing not Ethan but the alien growths wriggling beneath the surface, invisible yet palpable in the aura of sickness and fear that surrounded him. Driven by panic and the gnawing sense that he could not survive alone, Ethan ventured to a medical clinic on the edge of the city. The sterile fluorescent lights felt oppressive, the air heavy with disinfectant mingled with the faint, omnipresent stench of decay clinging to his hair. Nurses and receptionists glanced at him with subtle wariness, recoiling slightly when he lowered his hood to explain the situation. Doctors were no different, dismissive, cautious, even irritated. "It's likely dermatitis or folliculitis," one said, examining the minor lesions superficially, avoiding the larger, pulsating masses that writhed beneath his scalp. Ethan's protests were met with skepticism and polite disinterest, as if he were reporting hallucinations rather than a living invasion of his body. Panic clawed at his chest. Each tick of the clock in the clinic sounded louder, harsher, like a drum echoing inside his skull in sync with the writhing threads beneath his skin. As he returned home, hopeless and trembling, Ethan considered extreme measures. He had read obscure forums describing experimental procedures, parasitic extractions, and even underground surgeons willing to operate outside standard medical ethics. The thought both terrified and beckoned him, for the growths were now so aggressive that even minor movements triggered intense squirming beneath the skin, sending waves of pain and nausea coursing through his body. By the time he reached the apartment, the largest nodule had split slightly along a jagged seam, revealing writhing black threads that glistened wetly, pulsating with a rhythm that seemed synchronized with his own heartbeat. He collapsed into a chair, hands pressed to his scalp, tears running down his face, listening as the soft, wet squelches echoed throughout the room, the whispers coalescing into a chilling chant. "We grow, we learn, we are eternal." Night fell with oppressive speed, and Ethan, driven by a mixture of despair and forced courage, resolved to intervene himself. He gathered the sterile tools he could find, scissors, tweezers, antiseptic, and a small scalpel he had purchased online under the guise of a homecraft project. The room smelled of disinfectant, but beneath it was the ever-present iron tang of his own decaying flesh, mingling with the metallic stench of the pus that continually oozed from the nodules. He took a deep breath and lifted a section of hair, revealing one of the larger lumps near the base of his skull. The skin was stretched nearly to the breaking point, translucent in places, with tiny black threads wriggling just beneath the surface, like a nest of living, intelligent worms. As he pressed the scalpel against the skin, the lump responded violently. Threads lashed out, curling around his fingers, pulling and twisting with a strength that made his knuckles ache. Grayish pus bubbled from small fissures, the smell overwhelming, causing him to gag. Yet he forced himself to continue. With trembling hands, he cut into the nodule, and for the briefest moment, the threads retracted as though in fear, revealing a cavity lined with wriggling appendages, a pulsating mass of blackness that seemed conscious, aware, and hostile. Ethan recoiled, cutting deeper in desperation, and a fine mist of gray, metallic-scented pus erupted from the incision, coating his hands, clothes, and hair. The whispers were louder than ever, overlapping with his racing thoughts, commanding him, mocking him, drowning his sense of self. "We are stronger than you. We consume. You are ours." Hours passed in a blur of pain, wet squelches, and writhing appendages. Ethan worked feverishly, alternately cutting, pulling, pressing, trying to remove the largest masses. Each attempt was met with resistance, the threads curling around his tools, tangling, pulling, and slashing against his hands, embedding tiny barbs into his skin. At times, the lumps split spontaneously, releasing bursts of thick gray pus with the scent of rusted iron, the threads undulating outward, probing the air, seeking new surfaces to colonize. Ethan's own body had become alien to him. His scalp pulsed with independent motion, the lumps communicating with one another, expanding strategically, evading extraction. He was simultaneously operator and prisoner, executor and victim, locked in a struggle with something he could not fully comprehend.